everyone, and welcome back to the PetroNerds podcast. This is episode 76. This is part 2 of my conversation with John Grogan. I interned for John Grogan in UK Parliament in 2007. It's a great blast from the past conversation and a really good dive in terms of what's going on in the UK, what's going on with energy security, what's going on with UK grid. And in this part 2 of this conversation, we talk about the war in Ukraine. We get into China, Germany, Russia, the relationship. His vantage point, it is a little more political, and it's interesting. And I do clarify at the end of this that I'm not trying to be. We have a relatively provocative conversation on the harder stuff that people don't have, which is something like war fatigue, and the fact that this war costs money and that we have to talk about ammunition support and where the money is coming from, and we also have to talk about national security and grid stability and everything like that. So if you haven't listened to the previous podcast, which is part 1 with John Grogan, that's episode 75, please take a listen. This one will make a lot more sense. That being said, I will keep the timestamp. This is Monday, March 13th, 2023. The big things that have happened in the world that are still going on is the SVB fallout, which is the Silicon Valley Bank, where the Fed has come in and basically backstopped it and said they are not only doing the FDIC deposits, insuring those for $250,000, or insuring all the deposits. So basically depositors are able to get the money. And then they went even further and said basically they're covering everybody's deposits, but quote, this wasn't a bailout. So that has taken up headlines. We talked about that in last week's podcast. And that's the biggest thing happening right now. It has put some pressure on oil prices. We have seen Brent and WTI both come down under $82 for Brent, under $76 for WTI. And we talked about this in the previous podcast, and I realized that talking about this, the SVP, it does sound a lot and has a lot of hallmarks of the financial crisis in 2008. And I know a lot of folks don't say this is different, that the banks are more secure and everything, but I think it's really, really important to appreciate that this is just beginning. And so we're just in the initial stages of this. And that, just days ago and weeks ago, people said that this couldn't happen in the financial system because the banks were so secure and we had all these stress tests. And clearly that wasn't the case. So anyways, with that being said, really hope you guys enjoy the rest of this conversation with John Grogan, and talk to you soon. Bye. One of the biggest winners from all of this war has been China. And that is because Europe has purchased, there's an 86% increase in solar purchases from China to Europe over the course of 2022, in just the first 9 or 10 months of 2022, which is kind of, it's amazing because, Europe is supposed to be a bastion of democracy and of human rights. And it's really sad because not only are you outsourcing the CO2 emissions that everybody claims they want to get rid of, and it's just playing whack-a-mole, and buying it from China, but these solar panels come from the province of Xinjiang. They do come from forced labor. They do come from free to forced labor. There are internment camps in the province of Xinjiang. There are all kinds of human rights issues within China, and they are produced from coal. And so the life cycle emissions aren't even being, accounted for. And I just find it a little, this is a kind of a separate angle on the energy side, but it definitely gets into the energy security side a little bit as well. And the fact that Europe seems just very okay with buying windmills and solar panels from, China, and sort of trying to worry about, that stuff later. And yet, they look to the US and say, hey, we want to measure your emissions on your gas, now that we're importing your natural gas. And it just seems a little bit counterintuitive to actually having stability for energy.
Well, I suppose that's a very good critique of European government's decisions over the winter. But I suppose the counter would be, which does touch on the war really. I mean, European governments have been under tremendous pressure. 6 months ago, would they be able to keep the lights on?
Right.
They were desperately stockpiling gas. And trying to warn their citizens and their industries that we might not get through this winter without massive cuts. Trying to keep an alliance together. Is it a good thing that you've got this remarkable alliance? And from my point of view, thank God for Uncle Joe, because if Uncle Joe hadn't been there, I cannot see. And I was at a conference in Poland near the Belarus border just last week, and talking to the Poles and the Ukrainians there, I just cannot see that the world would have responded in the same way. And once that decision is made that we are going to defend the democracy and the integrity of Ukraine, there's massive costs for that, and those costs are being felt by consumers. Obviously, they're being mainly felt by the poor Ukrainian people and their brave soldiers, but the impact is in Europe. There's relatively strong support for the war in the UK. It is more nuanced in places like Germany and so on and things. So the politicians there have had quite a task to maintain support for this alliance, which is the most significant alliance, certainly for Europe and the States since the Second World War. And keeping that together has not been easy. And obviously, Putin is waiting for the day when it falls apart. And if he can keep going to the next American presidential elections, there's only one person he wants to win. And so there's that. So there are moral compromises, and lots of them have been made, I think. But given the centrality of that goal, as for China generally, and British and European attitudes to China, they have. I think Europe is very well aware of the moral shortcomings of the Chinese government, and there is there's a lot of debate now about the implications of Chinese investment into British and European security. We're not quite turning off TikTok yet, but that debate has got here as well.
Right.
I'm certainly not on TikTok. I don't want to, obviously one removed from the Chinese Communist Party. So those sorts of things are happening, and also a fear of what might happen in Taiwan. And if anything, the actions of Russia have woken up a lot of people to, what if China goes down a similar path? And we've just seen a Congress meeting in China, which has centralized power even more. So there is no challenge now.
Right.
To the president. And so, there is fear of China here. And obviously, Germany very much invested in trade with China, and Britain to a lesser extent. But there's always going to be those dilemmas. We're not saying we're going to break off trade with China, but in sensitive areas, I think we need controls, and we need constantly to raise issues of human rights. And obviously in the UK, we feel a special responsibility because of the historic links with Hong Kong.
Absolutely. And that's something that I think is it's very unique for the UK. It also is sort of there's a tie, right? So it's the Hong Kong tie. And I have, and I respect that, but I also, because of that tie and that historical relationship, it also puts you in a predicament of how close you've been with China historically, and how China has sort of bamboozled everyone, over the last 30 years, and thinking they're, actually reforming and democratizing when they're not. And that, now Hong Kong has been taken over. I know you guys have taken a lot of folks from Hong Kong into your country, but it's interesting. So you explained really well, how the Uncle Joe supporting the war, where Europe is sort of at, but that there does seem to be a clear rift between the UK and Germany on, something as big as, if Germany obviously allowed Europe the massive exposure that they had to Russia. And Russia is not an economic superpower. They should not have been able to wage this war. And one of the major reasons they were able to wage this war was because of the stranglehold for energy that they had. And the fact that because their economy isn't so, it's not super robust, it's also relatively resilient. So even with all the sanctions and everything on Russia, it's actually performed pretty well, because Europe continued to buy natural gas, like you were saying, that, stockpiling as much as they possibly could when it was still flowing. But then now you have the Chancellor of Germany, Olaf Scholz, seeming to double down on with China, which seems like you're kind of going in the opposite direction, and maybe on the wrong side of history here, because Olaf Scholz took 12 CEOs over to China. China's been very cozy with Russia on this whole on everything. Financial ties have continued to grow over the course of the war. But then there was also a lot of political opposition within Germany when Olaf Scholz sold part of the Hamburg port to the Chinese. But that kind of went under the radar as well. And it just seems that might be something where, especially with the UK being a little more of an independent mind, that this does not seem the best track to go on. And this is both a not just an energy security, this is this is a security issue and something for that has to be dealt with. That clearly Russia woke Europe up to the reality that even if you wanted the natural gas, you may not be able to get it, despite all the grievances you may have with Russia. And just like all the stuff that you may want from China, you may not be able to get it if there is a war with Taiwan, if there's stuff that's going on. And so that decoupling conversation and where countries are at, it seems like there could be rifts within Europe, particularly between the UK and other countries on this China issue.
There could be. I mean, I think now there's a willingness in the British government or a desire to have slightly closer links now with Europe and to talk these things through. It was very awkward after Brexit.
Right.
Under Mr. Johnson, Liz Truss, there's just been a deal done, fairly parochial issue, but nevertheless important, on Northern Ireland, which I think will ease relations with Britain and Europe. And I suppose, from the point of view of the alliance, I mean, you're right. Slots is courting China economically and trying to perhaps shift some of the emphasis from Russia. I mean, in a way, and I mean, you've got to have some dialogue with China because and Scholz has had that. And I would hope that one of the constraints on Russia, on Putin, on, for example, the use of nuclear weapons and so on and things, and on other areas where it might go over the line, is the influence of China and India. We haven't discussed India at all yet, but that they are certainly not with the West in terms of the alliance against Russia, but they are a constraint, perhaps the only constraint, on how far Putin will go. And so it's realpolitik and so on. But I'm glad that there's some part of the alliance talking to China, because you need to keep that open at the moment. Because, as I say, and hopefully, again, what is going to stop China invading Taiwan? And I think one of all the economic turmoil that you listed there that would come from that. One of the things would be the success of the alliance in Ukraine, because obviously that emphasises the price that can be paid for these immoral invasions and military adventures and so on and things. So it's not simple, but I think next winter Europe will have largely decoupled from Russian gas. Now, obviously, that will mean they'll try and sell it to China in greater.
Well, they are.
Greater volume.
Yep.
They are, yeah, and I mean, China's doing well out of it, isn't it? Because they're getting a good price for it. They're not paying a premium price. But there we are. Yeah, I one of the other things I do in my life is I chair the British Mongolian Chamber of Commerce. So Mongolia, if I may just say a little word about Mongolia,
absolutely,
it's slightly relevant to our debate. So that's that's obviously in the middle of China and Russia, and it is the most democratic country. From Japan to the Balkans, really, much more democratic than the Stans. Power rotates. There's freedom of the press. There is some corruption, but it's a pretty safe country. You don't have prominent business people. Don't have to have lots of bodyguards or anything. It's and it supplies. It's supplying coal into China. And diminishing. They realise it's a diminishing asset. But also copper, and they've got Rio Tinto's got, I think, the third biggest copper mine in the world, which is developing, and they've also got lots of rare earths, uranium. So they are going to be, if they can get it right, and they want to be more like Norway than Nigeria. And they're setting up their own sovereign wealth fund and things. But if they get it right, they can be quite an important influence, I think, in Asia. But they constantly have to play off China and Russia, and if anyone understands realpolitik, it's the Mongolians who trying to carve out a democracy in that part of the world is not easy.
Right. No, no, and they're in the mix of it. I try to sometimes I think listeners and folks like yourselves, I'm not trying to paint things as simple, but there's two things that I don't think ever get identified and clarified, and I don't hear on media outlets or anybody from UK or Europe or it is a real conversation on China. I mean, there's
Yes.
beginning dialogues on it, but the hard stuff that we're talking about now doesn't happen, and the hard stuff on
No.
energy doesn't happen either, and they're quite interrelated. I do want to
Yes.
loop back to the war issue because you said, thanks to Uncle Joe, and that Putin only wants one person in office, and I think that's an interesting, a couple comments, because I do think that war fatigue is something that I know that there's a lot of support, and Boris Johnson did a good job in raising UK support, and I think all across the US there's been a lot of support for the folks in Ukraine. That's a given across the aisle. But war fatigue is a real thing, and the US has put over $46 billion into the war, and the countries in Europe, including the UK, have put a handful of billions of dollars into the war. So we have funded it, and that there's criticism of that as well. But we have helped fund this, and the problem is that the reconstruction efforts for when and hopefully they happen, or I think Ukraine has put a $700 billion price tag on that for reconstruction, but it's ammunition support, and that this is again the hard conversation. No one talked about war in before. No one talked about ammunitions. By the way, you have to build this stuff with energy. It's probably not going to come from wind and solar power to make bullets and weapons and hard machinery. That's why China's in a really good place. That's why Russia is actually increasing their electricity capacity generation. Their ability to build this stuff is more resilient than the West, and I think that's a kind of a scary thing to think about, is that if the US is funding this with 46 billion and continuing to pay, there's a risk of war fatigue in terms of just economies deteriorating, but also in Europe the fact that the money, and you guys have smaller economies, so I'm not doing like for like there, but Europe hasn't put the money in, even though it's on the doorstep. And Europe also hasn't put the weapon financing. And the fact that we're all putting all these ammunitions and these weapons to it, they will have to be rebuilt. And so more will have to be manufactured. And that's a really, really serious thing. Even if the war was to end, you'd have to do that, because that in itself is a deterrence. Just like it would have been a deterrence for Putin not to invade Ukraine if Europe had supplied their own, instead of being exposed on 35 BCF a day of gas imports, that would have been a deterrent, but Europe didn't do that. And I think weapons and ammunition and the military side, which is very tricky with Germany and this whole debate, but it just seems like that war fatigue and the rebuilding of this stuff and making sure they have enough ammunition support does seem very, very critical. And I don't hear that being talked about a ton on the UK or European space, in the UK or European space.
I think people are acutely conscious of war fatigue, and this may take quite a long while. You're obviously right on the numbers, and that's why I say Uncle Joe is so important. Really, this would have been impossible without the U.S. administration backing it. Germany, although we've been talking about their critique on China and so on and things, they're the next biggest donor across the board in military and economic support, and I think the UK comes third.
Right.
So not insignificant. And then countries like Poland, poorer countries, where I was, they have a large proportion. I think at one point they had over a couple of million Ukrainians actually in the country, and some passing through. Then I think it was nearly 3 million. Some of them passing through to places like Britain and Germany. So there's been considerable impacts, and people have made considerable sacrifices and so on and things. But we've got to keep it going. And in some of these countries, it's quite marginal, the level of support. In most of the countries, there's still willingness to do that. But the Ukrainians, who incidentally have, I think, got a most, and if they can get peace, they'll have a brilliant economic future, because you've just seen the entrepreneurial
Right.
attitude of the young, really, and their government communications are just fantastic. The way from day one they were spinning their story out to the world, has, I think, helped keep up the support.
Yep.
And when Zelensky was in London, he was certainly pretty good at that. Yeah, but it is. You're right to say it has been across the aisle, and it has been across the aisle here in the UK. There is opposition Labour Party. There is are as vociferous as the Conservatives and so on. And so whatever happens in Britain in terms of elections, it won't affect the strength of support for the alliance. Italy's changed government, and yet it's still maintaining support. So I think in most European countries, Putin's obviously trying to find a wedge to start dividing us. But it does boil back to the centrality of the American elections next year. And you do hear voices, even though I accept it's across the aisle, you do hear some of perhaps of the newer members in the House who are Republicans. Perhaps you're not that fatigue has already set in. So when I was in Poland, there was people and in Poland now is ruled by a right of centre conservative government, many of whose members sympathised with the domestic agenda of President Trump, and they some of them regarded him as a hero. But when pressed, do they want him to come back next year? And what with the impact on the Polish war with Ukraine, when he's saying that he's going to end the war in a day, well, I don't think he's going to end it in a day, because Putin's going to say, well, that's it then, I'll withdraw to the borders. And so, there will be a lot of support for if he is the candidate in the States. Even in the European right, there'll be a lot of support for whoever his opponent is, whether it's Biden or anybody else, because of the war.
Yeah, I mean, I'll push back on that a little, mainly because I'm not, I don't enjoy getting into the political debates in the U.S. And frankly, I'm happy to criticize both parties. However, the economic resiliency we had in the previous administration was a hell of a lot better than we have under this current one. And fiscal spending has been kind of through the roof. The reason I bring up something like war fatigue and spending is because it's a hard topic, and I spend a lot of time, giving presentations and talking about geopolitics and everything, and literally was just at the Colorado School of Mines and had students asking me like, why do countries support wars that they're not in? There's really important reasons to do so. I think that absolutely. I mean, I think we have bipartisan support across the board in Europe, in the US, on supporting the Ukrainians, 100%. There's a deeper question, though, in terms of, and I don't think there's a reason that Poland would say Trump or whoever on the right. I mean, they're mainly some folks on the right in the U.S. are more pro energy or pro coal, and probably supportive of that. I do think it's unfair to say that, that if it was a Republican in charge, that we wouldn't have had as much support for Ukraine. I don't think that's necessarily correct, or that they would have been friendly with Putin. So I don't think that's correct. I do think it's been a little bit, everything's been thrown into this war. Everything's been thrown, I guess, into Putin being the greatest evil. And Russia is very bad. Putin is not a good person. And this is a very, very bad war. This is an ongoing war. Most people didn't think it was going to happen. The troops were lined up. I mean, this was going to happen. And then most people in Europe and elsewhere thought this was going to end pretty quickly. It hasn't. It's continued to go on. And it looks like more of a pawn move in a much larger game. And I think that that's where I just think that the reality check of, if China gets engaged in this, or the fact that China has been funding this war, and that Europe doesn't have and there's Europe and lots of folks within the US that don't have an honest appreciation for sort of the role of China within this, and that it gets complex and hairy, and we have lots of massive trade ties with China, and particularly, Europe has huge trade ties, especially on the energy front. And then when we start talking about the Inflation Reduction Act, I was listening to the Davos summit, and Ursula von der Leyen was talking about, the how wanted, Europe to be the clean tech hub, but that Europe was nearly like 99% completely reliant on China for that, but didn't want to be completely reliant on China. And then you had China get up saying how clean they were. When they're not clean, then they have mostly coal within their grid. And that's because that's for energy security. So, and then you have in the US, where now you have real conversations in Europe with a lot of concerns about the Inflation Reduction Act, which I'm not quite sure they should be as concerned, because it seems like in the US, what's going to happen with this Inflation Reduction Act is that we're going to spend a lot of money on things. I mean, we can't. Europe and the US is not going to mine or process the minerals and metals to make the batteries that are all made in China, because we have environmental standards, and we won't process these in our own countries. We don't even have the capacity. So that's all going to be done in China. So what we're going to do is we're going to buy all the batteries, and we're just going to build up really expensive charging stations, and that's probably where the money is going to get spent. And then you have to have a grid that supports that. So it seems like a lot of money could be spent, and that politics, depending on a change of elections, could shift that. And so that could be messy. And it seems I'm wondering if one, I would welcome your comments on what I was saying about Ukraine and China, but also, do you think that the Inflation Reduction Act, that's how it could play out as well, and that maybe Europe doesn't have as much to worry about because there's just going to be a lot of spending in the U.S. and not necessarily hugely impactful, especially if there's a change in administration?
I think a lot of spending will be in the States. I think it has an impact on internationally mobile companies and internationally mobile talent. Is the States the place to be now if you want to invest or work in renewable tech and so on and things? And so there's a debate in Britain and Europe that we better do something similar, otherwise we're going to lose out on a lot of the investment and a lot of the skills and the talent to the States. So I think there's that impact. And back to the war and Ukraine and China, yeah, as we were talking about, China is obviously an actor there, is getting some economic benefit from the war, but we just have to hope, and that there's talks of an alliance of authoritarian governments and things throughout the world. We have to try and divide them as best we can, China and Russia, and we also, I think, have to win, because if we lose, it's what signal does that give? I mean, that's going to be the repercussions for that are unimaginable, really, and what that does for the psyche of America and Europe as well. So I think, having got this far, we absolutely have to be on the winning side in this war, and that means that Ukrainian democracy and the Ukrainian nation, which President Putin wants to wipe off the face of the map,
Right.
are still around. For that, we have to win. I'm going to have to leave it at that point, unfortunately, and we can do a roundup if you like. But we've done an hour and a quarter, haven't we?
We absolutely, we've done a full hour on this. You've been on a little longer because we had some technical issues, but no, this has been a fantastic conversation. Absolutely appreciate it, and I will have you back on the podcast when we have we can do the proper video and everything, and we can chat again. So thank you very much, John. And when are you when are you running? When is your election?
So for background, so it's the election will probably be, because it's a 5-year term, which is up in December 2025. But now we have a system where the Prime Minister can basically go to the King and call an election. So it's very much of the government's choosing. So probably either May next year or June, or probably latest October next year. Yeah. But
okay.
The likelihood is I'll be an MP again, because even if, as you remember, it's a constituency system, and Keighley, where I'm standing, is 23rd of the most marginal seats. So there wouldn't even have to be a change of government, and this seat would fall on any swing, really, on any swing. So, and there is likely, the opinion polls at the moment give Labour a 20% lead. I think that will tighten But if they had any lead at all, Keatley would fall. So
Okay. Well, I appreciate that clarification. And well, when you win, I'll have to come in and help brief you guys on
you will.
energy and
You,
geopolitics
you
and
will,
everything.
and have dinner with James. We'll have to get James back.
Absolutely, absolutely we will. Yes, James Williamson.
His kids will be in school then, so he'll have less
All
excuse.
right,
But yeah,
fantastic. Well, thank you so much, John. Really appreciate it.
a pleasure.
All right,
Thank you. Bye
all
bye.
right, bye. All right, that was my conversation with John Grogan, the former member of parliament for the Selby constituency, who is also running again. So I am just going to clarify. I'm just going to clarify to listeners on a couple things because this podcast is going to be broken into two parts. So I'm going to clarify that I very much support the war in Ukraine in terms of supporting democracy and explaining that Putin is a very very bad actor and that we do have a semblance of alliance of this sort of a bit of a decoupling around the world where you're seeing entities like China just this weekend talked about actually orchestrated a meeting with Saudi Arabia and Iran. And so, Saudi Arabia or China gets most of their crude oil imports from Saudi Arabia, from Russia, and from Iran. And so we are seeing, these potential, these entities that are working together. And China has done a really good job of working with these actors that the rest of the world doesn't tend to want to necessarily work with as closely. But the reality is that what happens is that when you have this war in Ukraine put on by Putin, then you end up having you have Europe pushing themselves into the Middle East. And so you have tighter and closer relations with, with Europe and say the UAE. And now you have the UAE facing some secondary sanctions with support to the war in Ukraine. So it gets very complicated. The Middle East is not there's nothing uncomplicated about the Middle East. There's nothing uncomplicated about energy. There's nothing uncomplicated about war. And the ties and the interconnection in this global economy are extremely, extremely serious. So the reason I bring up war fatigue and the reason is not to criticize funding that goes into the war, is it is to the talk. It's similar to say, well, the energy transition is going to happen and we're all just going to give 9 trillion a year and it's just going to happen. It's not. That is not going to happen. And as economies are in pain, global economies are in pain, if we have a bad winter this coming winter in Europe and it's colder, or we have a very very hot summer and we're drawing down on natural gas and natural gas prices spike, and we're drawing down on the storage levels within Europe, we could see some real problems within the energy system, and we could see some real problems within the economies, and we could see some, I wouldn't say pushback on support for the war in Ukraine, but the ability to actually pay for it. And so what I'm saying is the longer these things get drawn out and the economic pain and the lack of resiliency and redundancies built in the system, especially for energy, the harder it is to maintain the support. So I think it's really important that countries have these conversations about economic stability, energy security, national security, and grid stability, so that they can actually develop these weapons and these ammunitions and support this. You don't have to, it's sort of like when I explain to folks that having coal in your back pocket, you don't have to use it, but it's a nice backup for energy security. And as John Grogan mentioned, that they had to turn coal-fired power on recently for backup, and that's how they're using natural gas. So these are really important conversations to be had. They are not necessarily easy conversations and they can get uncomfortable, but I really hope you guys enjoyed that conversation. Thank you so much for listening. Talk to you soon, folks. Bye.